standing at the foot of the pyramids. What if the story you think you know is not where it truly begins, but only where it briefly surfaces? What if the familiar tale of pharaohs, dynasties, and carved stone inscriptions is just the uppermost layer, resting on something far older and far quieter? As you listen, allow the rhythm of time to settle and let the land itself tell the story of the civilization erased before history began. When we stand here together in imagination, looking up at the weathered faces of these stones, we are really looking at the last echoes of a much longer journey. To follow that journey, we have to turn away from the shining surfaces and begin to listen for what lies underneath. Looking across the opens and around the pyramids, you see a landscape that at first seems almost empty, a broad plain, broken only by rock and wind. Yet beneath this apparent simplicity lie traces of forgotten builders' faint pathways, etched into the ground, quarries cut into bedrock, and alignments that do not belong to the age of the pharaohs. These are not the grand avenues and decorated causeways you find in later times, but subtle marks, the kind that only reveal themselves when you look slowly and carefully. They linger at the edges of the plateau, where the sand thins and the stone emerges, offering small clues in worn surfaces and half-minus buried cuts. Each of these quiet details invites us to ask who walked here first, long before any king's name was ever written down. When we look at the pyramids today, we see the surface of a story that is far older than the Egypt we read about in history books. Recorded Egyptian history begins with names and lists, with rulers remembered on stone and papyrus, but the land remembers more than the records do. The Giza plateau itself, the bedrock on which the pyramids stand, endured thousands of years of wind, sun, and sand long before the first dynasty ever rose. That stone is not just a foundation, it is a witness, holding in its worn edges and smoothed faces the quiet memory of ages without written voices. To hear that memory, we have to let the plateau, not the later monuments, become our starting point. Standing on the high rock of Giza in your mind, imagine running your hand along the bare bedrock that stretches out between the monuments. In some places it feels uneven, not carved with the straight lines and sharp corners you would expect from the later builders, but worn and softened, as if shaped first by nature and then by hands we no longer know. You can sense where stone has been taken away, where shallow depressions hinted old extraction, and where faint lines mark the direction of planned movement across the plateau. These are not yet the grand cuts of known quarries. They feel more like early experiments, tests in how to work with this stubborn rock. Such weathered, hesitant traces suggest a phase of activity that stands in the shadow of the pyramids, yet does not fully belong to them. Across the broad face of the plateau, the contrast between the great structures and the ground they rest upon creates a quiet puzzle. The pyramids rise in deliberate geometry, but the stone beneath them tells of a much longer relationship with time, a surface beaten by countless seasons. If the pyramids themselves belong to recorded Egyptian history, the plateau they stand on holds a story that reaches back before those records begin. The rock bears the marks of cycles of weather that would have come and gone long before anyone carved a royal name into stone. This difference in age between the monuments and their foundation is the first hint that we are standing in a layered landscape. Walking along the lower edges of the plateau in your imagination, you might notice places where the bedrock falls away into shallow depressions and narrow cuts. These hollows do not always align with the later, well-minus planned features you might expect from the builders of the pyramids. Instead, they seem scattered, exploratory, like the first careful steps of people learning how to read and shape this resistant stone. Here and there, you may see straight edges that have been softened by long weathering, suggesting work done in a time when no written plan has survived. Such scattered remnants hint at activities older than the neat, organized work of the royal projects. Along the paths that now exist between the great monuments, imagine earlier routes worn by unrecorded feet. Before there were, of causeways and formal processions, there would have been simple treks. The most efficient lines between quarries, working areas, and rising structures over long stretches of time. Repeated movement can press faint pads into the earth, leaving behind subtle differences in texture and level that linger even after the people are gone. These quiet pathways, half miners lost under sand, may trace the movements of those first planners who understood the Plato's possibilities before anyone raised a royalton here. Following such invisible roads in our minds guides us toward the people who shaped the stage before the main performance began. Near the bases of the pyramids, where modern visitors focus on the towering sides and sharp angles, the ground itself offers another kind of evidence. If you look down instead of up, you may notice irregular cuts and shallow trenches that do not match the grand design above. Some areas seem to have been leveled long before the final layout of monuments was fixed, as if earlier builders were preparing the ground for something that changed over time. Weathering has softened the edges of these features, blurring their original shape and purpose, but the underlying intention, a desire to organize and tame the plateau, still whispers through them. These subdued preparations hint at a slow evolution of plans stretching back beyond the familiar dynastic story. At the far reaches of the plateau, where the towering structures fall away into open rock and sand, the evidence becomes subtler and, in a way, more evocative. Here you might find isolated cuts, seemingly purposeless by themselves, and flat surfaces that look as if they were once working areas. They are not engraved with texts or decorated with scenes, because they weren't ever meant to be seen as finished monuments. Instead, they feel like the backstage of a very old theater, where the machinery of construction once operated long before the first scripted drama appeared. This hidden backstage suggests a technological and organizational foundation that does not belong solely to the Age of Kings. The story of the pyramids usually begins with named pharaohs and precise reigns, but the ground beneath them carries marks that point to a world older than any inscription. When we focus only on the written record, we step into history at the moment it decides to speak in a formal voice. Yet the stone remembers ages before that, ages in which knowledge could be passed, plans could be made, and structures could rise without leaving behind official records. The presence of quarries, pathways, and alignments beneath and around the later monuments suggests that the plateau was already a place of organized activity before writing preserved its names. To understand how deep this organization might run, we have to keep listening to the landscape itself. Across the wide face of the desert, the pyramids appear as fixed points, but the plateau on which they stand has lived through transformations we can only imagine. Long before the first dynasty, the stone here endured thousands of years of weathering winds, scraping dust across its surface, occasional rains cutting shallow tracks, temperature extremes fracturing its outer layers. This slow, relentless shaping left the bedrocks, often in some places, hardened in others, creating natural platforms and lines that later builders would either use or reshape. By the time the pharaohs turned their attention to this place, the plateau was already an old, experienced foundation, offering both opportunities and constraints. Those earlier natural and human interactions with the stone form the muted preface to the monumental story. If you picture the plateau as a vast, ancient book, the pyramids are only the bold titles written onto its final pages. The earlier chapters are more difficult to read, shallow cuts obscured by erosion, faint alignments partially buried in drifting sand, and irregular surfaces hinting at once deliberate leveling. These older signs did not announce themselves with grandeur. They wait, almost erased, under the weight of later achievements. Yet when you trace them with your attention, a pattern begins to emerge, suggesting that careful hands were measuring, marking, and planning here before recorded Egyptian history begins. The more we follow these traces, the more the idea of forgotten builders moves from fantasy to quiet possibility. Beneath the desert surface around Giza, imagine layers of activity stacked one upon another like faint imprints. The most recent layers are easy to see: the Great Pyramids, their associated structures, their surrounding fields of smaller tombs and constructions. But beneath these lie older, less defined layers, earlier quarry cuts, tentative pathways, perhaps even alignment tests that have been reused or overwritten. We cannot always separate these layers neatly, yet their overlapping presence insert continuity, a tradition of working this plateau that began long before rulers carved their names into stone. This sense of layered occupation invites us to see the Giza Plateau not as a single project, but as the long-term canvas of an evolving knowledge. From the vantage point of the high plateau, looking out over the surrounding desert, it is easier to appreciate just how deliberate the placement of the pyramids is. They do not sit randomly on scattered hills, but occupy prominent positions along the solid rock, taking advantage of elevation and stability. Such deliberate use of the plateau suggests that the people who chose these spots understood the underlying stone extremely well, including how it had been shaped by countless years of weather. That understanding does not appear overnight. It suggests a tradition of observation and trial that might reach back to communities whose names have not survived. The great monuments may thus be the visible crest of a much older wave of knowledge. Walking mentally along the imaginary lines, connecting different features on the plateau, you might notice subtle alignments that existed even before the pyramids fixed their famous geometry into the landscape. Straight paths between early quarries and working areas, oriented not only for convenience, but perhaps to test directions and foundations, could prefigure later, more exact alignments. These rudimentary lines would not yet match the refined precision seen in the final monuments, but they reveal an underlying habit of organizing space with intention. When such practical alignments are later repurposed or echoed in grand designs, they become part of a continuous lineage of planning that begins in obscurity. Following this lineage back in our minds brings us closer to the unknown hands that first met this rock. Near the transitions where natural rock meets carved surface, the boundary between geology and architecture becomes blurred. These edges show how much the plateau had already been weathered into particular forms before any tool touched it, and how later cutting sometimes followed those natural lines. In some places, the human work seems to extend what nature had already begun, deepening a fracture here, squaring off a ledge there, turning random breaks into purposeful surfaces. This cooperation between existing rock falls and later design suggests that early observers had spent long periods studying how the stone behaved under time and weather. Their quiet familiarity with the plateau's skeleton may be one of the oldest traces of the forgotten builder's presence. Along the shallow slopes leading up to the pyramid bases, the stone underfoot sometimes appears more worn than the monumental blocks above. This contrast reminds us that while the pyramids represent a specific historical moment, the ground they occupy had already faced the desert's patient work for ages. The softer, rounded edges of the exposed bedrock tell of long exposure, far exceeding the lifespan of any single structure. When such weathered surfaces show signs of intentional modification, we are likely seeing the remains of very early interventions, made at a time when the plateau still belonged to an unnamed world. The gentle clash between these ancient surfaces and later sharp geometry keeps whispering that the story runs deeper. On the quiet outskirts of the plateau, away from the familiar silhouettes, envision low rises of rock and shallow pits that do not attract much attention. They might look like nothing more than irregularities in the terrain, but some of them bear marks of having been trimmed, flattened, or tested by tools. These are not the grand, efficient quarries of a fully mature building tradition. Rather, they seem like tentative steps, places where techniques and strategies were being explored. The long weathering that has passed since then has made them modest and obscure, blending their forms back into the landscape. Yet their very humility makes them powerful clues that organized stonework here predates the age framed by history books. Turning your focus beneath the surface in your imagination, think of the plateau not just as a single layer of rock, but as a vertical archive. The uppermost layer, now exposed, has been shaped by both natural forces and human hands over tens of centuries. Deeper layers, still hidden, have endured even longer and may hold the earliest evidence of how the stone was once approached and tested. We cannot see those deepest layers directly, but the patterns visible on the surface, where old cuts meet newer ones, where weathered planes intersect with sharper lines, hint at a long, complex interaction between people and this ancient foundation. This sense of vertical depth adds another dimension to the mystery of who first learned to read this stone. From a distance, the desert around Giza appears unchanging, a vast, silent sea of sand and rock. Yet when we look closely at the plateau, we see that it has not always been as we find it now. It has been shaped, prepared, and repurposed across spans of time that exceed any single political era. The pyramids occupy only one chapter in this ongoing transformation, a chapter made visible by its scale, but not necessarily by its originality in using the rock. Earlier chapters might have involved smaller constructions, experimental layouts, and modest quarries that have since been erased or absorbed by later work. These subtle signs of change before the pyramids hint at a preparatory stage in which the forgotten builders refined their understanding of this place. When we imagine the first people to take notice of the Giza Plateau as more than a simple rise of rock, we can picture them standing, as we do, at its edge. They would have seen a broad, elevated platform of stone emerging from the surrounding sands, durable and commanding, a natural stage inviting human intention. Perhaps they walked its length, tested its surfaces, and began to mark it in small ways, but over time grew into more deliberate acts of shaping. Those earliest marks would have had no reason to survive in records. They were practical, exploratory, and unadorned. Yet their effects linger in the way later builders inherit a landscape already partially tamed. The familiar narrative of Egyptian history encourages us to begin with the appearance of writing, taking the first recorded names as the true beginning of complex organization. But the plateau at Giza reminds us that people can plan, experiment, and build in highly coordinated ways without ever leaving a written trace. The traces they do leave, quarries that predate known projects, pathways that run beneath later constructions, weathered alignments that no later designs fully explains, speak in a different language. It is the language of layout and labor, of stone cut and moved according to patterns we can sense but not fully reconstruct. Listening to this older language pulls us gently beyond the limits of recorded history. Around the bases of the pyramids, some of the stone surfaces appear as if they were cut or leveled long before the final structure took shape. These underlying preparations may have served multiple generations of planners, adjusted and reused as new ideas and needs arose. The fact that certain cuts and platforms do not align perfectly with the finished monuments suggests that earlier intentions were revised over time. Each revision leaves faint overlaps, where older plans meet newer ones and neither fully erase the other. These overlaps form a quiet palimpsest of design decisions, stretching back toward builders whose names have long since been lost. Farther out, where the plateau begins to descend toward the open desert, scattered blocks and worked surfaces hint at activity beyond the immediate footprint of the pyramids. Some of these features may be remnants of staging areas, places where stone was shaped, stored, or tested before being integrated into larger structures. Over long spans of weathering, the edges of such areas blur, and their original purposes become difficult to define with certainty. Yet their persistence, even in this softened state, proves that the exploitation and modification of the plateau extended beyond the neat boundaries of later monumental complexes. The scale and spread of such quiet evidence suggest a longer, broader tradition of working this landscape. Looking again at the relationship between the great monuments and the rock below, it becomes difficult to see the pyramids as completely isolated masterpieces. Instead, they begin to appear as the culmination of an extended conversation between humans and this particular stretch of stone. That conversation, carried out over thousands of years of observation and experimentation, likely involved many phases of building and quarrying that never received the credit of written remembrance. Only when we place the pyramids back into this longer continuum do the traces of forgotten builders around and beneath them make sense. They reveal themselves as the groundwork of a story that modern narratives often skip over. The idea that the pyramid's story is older than recorded Egyptian history might seem at first like a poetic exaggeration, but the plateau's weathered surface gives it concrete weight. The rock has been here for unimaginable spans of time, suffering unsurviving cycles of climate and erosion long before any organized building began. What matters for us is not just the age of the stone itself, but the span of human interaction with it before those interactions gained written names and dates. Every faint path, every half-minus erased quarry, every misaligned cut that fails to match later plans suggests that this interaction began earlier than our standard timelines comfortably allow. This gentle pressure from the evidence is what invites us to look for a civilization behind the one we think we know, moving through the plateau in thought, from its highest points to its weathered edges. You begin to see it less as a backdrop and more as a central character. It is a character that has been shaped into ways first by the immense slow hand of time, and then by the more focused, but still ancient, hands of people. Between these two forces, a landscape of potential was gradually carved out, one that later kings could harness but did not originate. The traces of that earlier human role, subtle alignments, early quarries, worn working surfaces feel like signatures without names. They hint at organized groups who treated this plateau as a resource and a stage long before it became a royal symbol. Standing once more before the pyramids in your imagination, you might notice how small the visible structures are compared to the vastness of the bedrock beneath them. The monuments rise a certain height above the ground, but their real foundation is the immense mass of stone that extends unseen below and around them. In the same way, the recorded history of Egypt is atop an even larger, mostly hidden foundation of earlier human experience and knowledge. The scattered traces of forgotten builders under the desert floor are the faint edges of that foundation, just barely accessible to our modern eyes. By paying attention to these edges, we begin to sense the scale of what has been lost. The Giza Plateau, with its long weathered surfaces and quiet scars of human work, thus becomes a threshold between two worlds. On one side lies the world of names, dates, and carved records, where the actions of rulers and architects are preserved in formal memory. On the other side lies an older, nameless world, where people still measured, planned, and built, but allowed their deeds to fade into the anonymity of stone and sand. The traces beneath the desert, the pathways, quarries, and alignments that predate the pharaohs belong to this second world. To cross this threshold in our minds is to accept that the story of the pyramids reaches back into a deeper, more mysterious past. As we linger at this threshold, you can feel the quiet tension between what we know and what we can only infer. The evidence of older activity on the plateau does not shout, it suggests, hints, and beckons without forcing a single conclusion. Yet as each small clue accumulates, the weathered cuts, the underlying platforms, the misaligned traces of early organization, a picture of continuity slowly takes shape. It is the picture of a landscape used, studied, and shaped over many generations, including generations that never appeared in official history. Following that picture forward, we begin to suspect that the builders of the pyramids inherited far more than just a piece of rock. So when we ask where the story of the pyramids truly begins, the answer seems to move ever farther back from the moment of construction itself. It moves back into the time when the plateau was first recognized as a valuable foundation, when its stone was first tested, its surfaces first organized by deliberate human hands. It moves back into centuries, perhaps millennia, in which knowledge about this landscape was quietly accumulated through practice rather than written down. That long, invisible period is where the forgotten builders leave their most important legacy, not in surviving structures, but in the subtle readiness of the land itself. In the next steps of our journey, we will follow that legacy beyond Giza, into other traces that deepen this quiet, older story. Standing again on the Giza plateau, you can feel that the stone beneath your feet has watched far more seasons than any monument that rests upon it. The wind moves across the open ground, brushing sand into the same shallow hollows it has visited for thousands of years, tracing old lines again and again. Around you rise the familiar shapes of the pyramids, but scattered between them are rough cuts, broken edges, and weathered faces that whisper of older work. This is where the quiet anomalies begin to gather, in the way rock wears, in the angles stone holds, in patterns that do not quite fit the official story. From here, our path turns slowly toward one of the most debated figures on this plateau, the weathered guardian that looks east across the desert. Standing at the base of the Sphinx, you notice first its size, then its scars. The body is cut directly from the bedrock, its flanks carved out of the natural limestone ridge, and along these flanks run deep, vertical channels. These channels fall straight down the walls of the enclosure and along the sides of the body, not like the shallow, horizontal peeling you would expect from dry desert winds. They resemble the work of heavy, repeated rainfall water pouring down the walls over long periods of time, cutting grooves that ignore the horizontal layers of the stone. This pattern invites us to ask what kind of climate could have carved such marks into the Sphinx when the modern desert knows only rare and fleeting storms. Walking slowly around the enclosure, you move your hand along the stone and feel how the grooves deepen and soften toward the base. Some interpretations of this weathering suggest that the most intense erosion dates to a time between roughly 10,000 and 8,000 BC, when the Sahara was not yet a vast desert, but a greener, wetter landscape. If this is even partly correct, the rock surface carrying these marks may have stood exposed to heavy rains thousands of years before the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. This does not by itself tell us who carved the Sphinx or when every detail of its form was finished, but it stretches the life of its stone shelf far beyond conventional dates. The story usually begins with a king of the 4th dynasty, but the ground around the Sphinx hints gently at a history that a much older sky and climate. From certain angles, you can see how the head of the Sphinx seems slightly small compared to the massive, eroded body that surrounds it. The lines of the face are sharper and less weathered, while the shoulders and ribs show the softened, rounded shapes of stone that has endured far more wear. Some have suggested that this may point to minus carving, to an older body whose head was reshaped or replaced in a later age. But the evidence remains debated and incomplete. What remains firm is the contrast between the heavily worn enclosure walls and the smoother, later repairs around the pause and lower structures, which frame the older erosion instead of erasing it. This contrast leaves us with the sense that the Sphinx is not a single moment in time, but a layered object, carrying stacked episodes of work and weathering on its back. Stepping away from the Sphinx and along the low quarry faces around the plateau, the same theme appears in quieter form. Blocks have been cut from the bedrock in steps and ledges, and the exposed surfaces behind them carry their own mix of horizontal bedding and vertical wear. In some places, the stone looks freshly broken by comparison, while in others it has taken on the same softened, water-minus sculpted look we saw in the Sphinx enclosure. These quarries may have supplied stone for known monuments, but they also show that the landscape itself was being carved and tested long before any smooth pyramid casing rose above it. The story usually starts with finished monuments, but these scarred quarry walls remind us that the first chapters are written directly into the bedrock beneath them. Walking north toward the Great Pyramid, the clean geometry of its mass contrasts sharply with the roughness scattered around its base. On the outside, most of what we see today is the core, not the original polished casing. Yet even in this stripped state, the structure's alignment with the cardinal directions is strikingly precise. Inside, narrow shafts run out from the chambers at fixed angles, small tunnels cut with such regularity that they keep a steady course through tens of meters of stone. These features, together with the smooth surfaces and tight joints of certain interior blocks, suggest a level of planning and layout that goes far beyond simple stacking of stones. Once we step into the heart of the Great Pyramid, a different class of anomaly appears, one tied not to age and climate, but to precision in the act of building itself. Inside the king's chamber, the granite surfaces catch faint light and reveals, if you look closely, in certain places, small circular impressions and spiral minus-like striations suggest that a rotating to the hard stone, cutting with a consistent, controlled motion. To shake granite in this way with the copper tools and simple abrasives we usually imagine for the Old Kingdom would require extraordinary patience and skill, perhaps combined with techniques we do not fully understand. The evenness of these marks, their smooth curves and regular spacing, hint at a stable process repeated many times, not at random chipping or casual, irregular handwork. Here, the puzzle shifts. Instead of asking how old the stone is, we begin to ask how the builders achieved such refinement with the tools we think they had. Standing in that chamber, surrounded by heavy blocks, locked together with almost no visible gap, you sense both mastery and mystery in the method. The drill minus-like traces suggest that the builders could guide tools along precise paths and control pressure finely enough to leave consistent grooves in unforgiving material. Some seem this the echo of a long tradition of stonework, maybe refined far from Giza and only later brought here, while others argue these marks fall within the reach of known ancient techniques. Whatever conclusion you lean toward, the evidence in the stone is steady. The work was not improvised, but executed with deliberate, repeatable processes that leave their own quiet signature. The story usually begins with blocks, hauled and stacked under royal command, but these intimate marks hint at a heritage of craftsmanship that might reach back beyond the visible monuments. Stepping back outside into the sun, you find another set of clues scattered almost casually around the edges of the pyramid fields. Unused or partially shaped blocks line air ramps, in pits, and the long old construction paths, like pages torn from a technical notebook and left behind. On some of these stones, long straight lines or shallow grooves resemble what we would expect from copper saws working with sand as an abrasive, creating broad, recognizable cutting patterns. Yet on other blocks, the striations differ. The lines may curve, cross, or arrange themselves in ways that do not match the typical marks associated with standard Old Kingdom tools. These differences do not shout an answer, but they ask a persistent question about how many kinds of cutting methods and traditions passed through this site before and during pyramid construction. Nailing beside one such block, you might trace your fingers along a set of grooves that shift in direction more abruptly than a simple back minus and minus fourths saw cut would suggest. Instead of a single rhythm, you find more than one pattern layered on the same surface, as though the stone has been worked, then reworked, by tools of slightly different character. Some lines appear to fade into others, hinting that an earlier set of cuts was partially erased or overwritten by later correction. This layering raises the possibility that at least some of these blocks or the no-minus how used on them, come from a longer experimental history of stone cutting, not from a single, uniform technology. When we look at these quiet, discarded pieces, we begin to sense that the Giza Plateau functioned not only as a building site, but as a place where techniques themselves were tested and refined. Walking farther from the main pyramid cluster toward the modern settlement near an AZ at L-Saman, the ground changes character again. Here, excavations and deep cuts in the earth have revealed blocks buried well below the current surface, stones that do not sit in the neat, horizontal courses familiar from Old Kingdom constructions. Some of these deeply buried pieces lie at angles or orientations that do not match the prevailing layout of later masonry in the area, suggesting an older or different organizational object beneath. The chisel marks on them, too, can differ in depth, spacing, or direction from the more typical tool patterns seen in confident 4th Dynasty work, as though shaped by hands trained to another rhythm. These hidden stones suggest that around Giza and AZ and L-Saman the subsurface holds traces of building activity that do not quite align with the canonical pyramid-age blueprint. Looking at these lower layers, you might imagine a time when this ground was organized according to a plan, now mostly erased by later leveling and reconstruction. Perhaps walls, platforms, or other features once extended here, only to be buried, repurposed, or cut through when newer projects demanded fresh foundations closer to the plateau. In that case, what we now read as the base level might be merely the top of an older architectural landscape, partly dismantled, partly reused, and mostly stripped of context. The story usually begins with the visible horizon of stone, but these sunken blocks hint at a deeper stratigraphy of human shaping, reaching down toward levels we have barely sampled. From Giza itself, the anomalies in weathering, precision, tool marks, and buried structures invite us to widen our view beyond this single site. Turning your gaze away from the Nile Valley, you follow an imagined line southwest, out into the desert where the land dips into seasonal basins that once held water. In one such basin, known today as an playa, stones rise against an empty horizon, forming circles and alignments that seem almost fragile in their isolation. Here, megaliths and smaller standing stones have been arranged in patterns that researchers interpret as alignments with particular stars, suggesting deliberate astronomical intent. The age estimates for these constructions reach back toward around 9000 BCE, placing them thousands of years before the first dynastic kings of Egypt walked along the Nile. When we stand in this quiet, remote place, in our mind's eye, the idea of careful sky watching and stone setting becomes part of a much older North African tradition. Walking around one of the stone circles at playa, you can imagine figures watching the night sky, tracing the motion of bright points across the darkness above the open plain. Certain stones appear to mark specific directions on the horizon, positions where stars would rise as set at predictable times of the year. To use stone in this way, as a fixed memory of repeating patterns in the heavens, requires patience, measurement, and an understanding that the sky can be read like a slowly turning clock. This is not monumental architecture in the sense of towering pyramids, but it is still precise work, embedding celestial relationships into the landscape with a kind of quiet mathematical care. The story usually begins with Egyptesque, written calendars and temple alignments, but playa suggests that people here were already linking sky to stone long before any hieroglyph was carved. From playa, if we draw an invisible map back toward Giza, a pattern begins to form in our thinking. We have, on one hand, a remote desert site where stone circles track the sky at around 9000 BCE, and on the other, a later plateau where colossal monuments appear to embody complex alignments and measures. Between them lies millennia of unknown cultural development, migration, and the gradual drying of the Sahara events that could have carried fragments of knowledge eastward. In this light, the anomalies of precision at Giza feel less like isolated miracles and more like possible culminations of earlier, scattered experiments in reading land and sky together. To see whether this idea holds, we turn to one of the most discussed alignments associated with the pyramids themselves. Standing again on the Giza plateau at dusk, you can watch the belt of Orion rise above the eastern horizon, 3 bright stars marching upward in a diagonal line. Many have noticed that the 3 main pyramids at Giza form a pattern that resembles these 3 stars, with 2 nearly in line and a third offset slightly to one side. Models of the night sky show that the configuration of Orion's belt has changed subtly over tens of thousands of years due to the slow wobble of Earth's axis. According to such models, the layout of the Giza pyramids appears to match the belt's pattern more precisely around 10,500 BC than it does in the pyramid-minus building era of the 4th dynasty. The story usually begins with builders looking up at their own contemporary sky, but this comparison invites the question of whether they were instead mirroring a remembered, much older sky. Walking along the diagonal that runs through the 3 pyramids, you can feel how this alignment links them into a single composition rather than 3 separate projects. If the ground plant truly reflects the belt of Orion as it appeared around 10,500 BCE, then the designers may have been encoding not just a star pattern, but a specific epoch in celestial history. This does not demand the existence of a vanished high technology. It could also suggest a tradition in which the memory of an ancient sky configuration was preserved unritualized. Yet, together with the precession of the equinoxes and the great span of time involved, it remains a quiet, unresolved puzzle that adds depth to the question of how far back the planning roots of Giza might reach. When we combine this with the older Minos-looking weathering at the Sphinx and the early star work at Playa, a picture emerges of long Minos-term engagement with the heavens anchored in enduring stone. If you pause for a moment amid these threads, the number of questions can feel almost overwhelming. We have heavy rain erosion on the Sphinx enclosure that may tie the exposed rock to a greener Sahara around 10,000–8,000 BC. We have stone circles and megalith at Playa apparently aligned with stars at roughly 9,000 BCE, hinting at early sky Inus watching in the deep desert. We have precision in the Great Pyramid shafts and drill minus like marks in the King's Chamber suggesting advanced, carefully controlled stoneworking techniques, as well as unusual striations on some unused Giza blocks, and atypical chisel marks near an A's, you let L-Saman. To let these details settle into a coherent impression, rather than noise, we need to return to the land itself and listen for the quiet patterns that link them. Walking slowly back across the plateau in your imagination, you might begin to sort these anomalies into a few simple categories. Some relate to age and climate, the heavy rain marks on the Sphinx and certain quarry faces, which point to conditions that no longer exist here today. Others speak of technique and precision, the alignment of colossal structures, the regularity of drill minus like traces in granite, the subtle differences in tool marks from block to block. Still others hint at buried or underlying organization, like the strangely oriented stones found deep near an AZ, let L-Saman, suggestive of older patterns hidden under later work. Taken together, they do not hand us a finished narrative, but they suggest that whatever happened here unfolded across more time, more experiments, and more forgotten episodes than the surface record alone can explain. Sitting with these patterns for a while, you may find your curiosity settling into a calmer, more focused shape. Rather than chasing a single dramatic explanation, you begin to see value in the small consistencies, the repeated use of stone to track the sky, the tendency to reuse and reshape older surfaces, the habit of building new forms atop older footprints. If you found meaning in this slow and peaceful style, leave a comment to share your thoughts or request the next topic you'd like us to explore. The anomalies at Giza and in the surrounding desert do not demand one neat answer, but they encourage us to imagine a long chain of hands learning, adjusting, and carrying techniques forward. To follow that chain more concretely, we have to look at the cultures that moved across this landscape before the pharaohs, leaving behind quieter traces of planning and engineering. From this vantage point, the Sphinx no longer stands alone as a mysterious outlier carved once and left to erode. Instead, it becomes one node in a wider network of stone features, some weathered by long-vanished rains, some cut with puzzling precision, some buried under later constructions or scattered in remote basins. The vertical channels on its enclosure walls whisper of a time when water shaped this ground in ways, winging it conceptually to the wetter eras suggested by an aptaplia. Meanwhile, the carefully oriented mass of the Great Pyramid points both to the cardinal directions and, perhaps symbolically, to the shifting sky above, echoing the same preoccupation with celestial order found in those farm-iness of stone circles. The story usually begins with named kings' undated reigns, but the geological and architectural anomalies nudge us toward a much deeper, layered origin story written in stone and climate. As you picture the three great pyramids under a different sky, perhaps one matching the belt of Orion around 10,500 BCE, the idea of inherited memory becomes more tangible. A design that fits an ancient star pattern may suggest that the builders were not simply copying what they saw in their own time, but translating an older, venerated scheme into monumental form. If traditions of sky-watching on stone alignment existed in places like an aptaplia millennia earlier, it is not difficult to imagine such knowledge being preserved, adapted, and finally crystallized in the high art of pyramid layout. This remains a suggestion, not a settled fact, but it offers a way to connect the precise, unexplained aspects of Giza's architecture with the older astronomical work hinted at in the wider desert. To test this idea further, we need to look beyond monuments and into the quieter remains of everyday engineering in the regions that fed into the Nile Valley. The longer we walk through this landscape in our minds, the more the anomalies begin to feel less like exceptions and more like the visible tips of a submerged pattern. Erosion that speaks of forgotten rains, alignments that recall ancient skies, tool marks that hint at unsung refinements, and buried blocks that refuse to fit into tidy chronological boxes. All of these are fragments of a larger, unresolved puzzle. They are not enough to reconstruct the full story of a pre-Minos dynastic civilization, but they are more than random noise. They cluster around themes of continuity in stonework, astronomy, and site reuse. In this phase of our journey, we have traced how geological and architectural details quietly stretch the timeline and complexity of activity at and around Giza. To move closer to the people behind these marks, we now turn toward the precursor cultures whose settlements, quarries, and alignments may represent the missing chapters between the Green Sahara and the age of the pyramids. Along the low, flat expanse of the Nile Delta, far from the sharp silhouette of the pyramids, lie the quiet traces of some of the earliest planned communities in this landscape. At sites like Rindiand Comel Ahilgn, the ground has yielded evidence of settlements from around 4,800 BCE, where dwellings and activity areas are not scattered at random but set out with a sense of order. Among these remains are signs of fine craftsmanship and early metallurgy, suggesting that people here were already shaping metal with care and intention thousands of years before the Old Kingdom. The story of Egypt is often told as if it begins suddenly with dynasties and stone monuments, but these planned settlements hint at a slower, deeper preparation beneath that familiar surface. To understand how this quiet planning connects to the later world of Giza, We need to follow the lines of water that shaped these early lives. Across the damp margins of the delta, where river and land constantly negotiate their boundaries, faint traces of early water management still rest beneath later layers of silt. Archaeologists have identified channels that are remarkably straight and deliberate, cut into the earth to guide and control the flow rather than simply follow it. These are not casual ditches. They suggest someone measured, aligned, and maintained them with a clear idea of how waters should move through this landscape. In these early channels, we see the outline of minds that could think in advance about flow, gradient, and distribution, long before the great river was harnessed by state-level projects. The precision in these quiet works of mud and water invites us to ask where else such deliberate planning appears outside the delta's soft ground. If we stand among the imagined houses of Nirindi or Com-el-Minske, ILGN, the details of daily life begin to form a pattern in the mind. Fine craftsmanship, the working of early metals, and the organized layout of space all point toward a community that valued control, repeatable processes, and shared standards. In such a place, knowing the exact width of a channel or the correct proportions of an ally would matter in ways that go beyond survival, hinting at a culture where technical skill carried status. The tools and methods used here would not yet be those of pyramid builders, but they may represent the foundations of thinking in measurements and tolerances that later stonework would require. To trace this foundation back even further, we need to leave the wet delta and step into a much older, drier silence, far to the southwest, in a region sometimes called the Black Zone of the Sahara. The desert-floored archons underfoot and scattered stones begin to take on deliberate shapes. Here, rock art marks surfaces with scenes and symbols, while low stone mounds and circles rise just enough above the sand to suggest human intention rather than chance. Among these features, a straight trench, dating back to around 7000 BCE, cuts through the landscape in a way that does not fit the wandering forms of erosion, and its orientation hints at a planned relationship with the sky. In this quiet, wind-worn zone, the combination of art stone structures and a precisely directed trench suggests a place where both earth and heavens were observed with care. To see who might have made such choices, we look toward the earliest sky readers of North Africa. Across the open spaces of the ancient Sahara, long before it hardened into the desert we see today, groups of early observers seem to have watched the night sky with patient repetition. From around 10,000 to 6,000 BC, stone alignments were set out in ways that track the rising and setting points of stars like Sirius and Orion, using the land itself as a quiet instrument of observation. These alignments are not random scatterings of rock. Their repeated orientations suggest that people return to them, check them, and refine them over long spans of time. The story of astronomy is often told as if it blossoms only with later civilizations, but here we see its roots as simple lines on the ground, maintained by generations who learned to read both horizon and star. These sky readers, living in a greener Sahara, may have carried their knowledge with them as the climate shifted and their world began to dry. Standing beside one of these stone lines in your mind, you can imagine how much patience it would take to notice that Sirius rises just a little differently from season to season and year to year, marking its position with stones. Then adjusting those stones over centuries would build not only a map of the sky but also a tradition of careful, cumulative measurement. Such a tradition trains people to trust long minus-term patterns, to remember alignments passed down as instructions, and to think of space in terms of fixed reference points, a habit of mind that later builders would need when they aligned monuments with remarkable accuracy. These early sky readers were not using metal tools or cutting limestone blocks, but they were already practicing the art of laying invisible grids of meaning across the land. As the environment shifted and water became harder to find, this habit of thinking in alignments, never quiets, killed the ability to manage fading water. Across what is now a wide, arid belt of sand, the earliest traces of water engineering lie scattered like faint footprints in a vanished marsh. Wells, channels, and basins appear across the Saharan in the pharaohs region, each one a small, deliberate intervention in the movement and storage of water. These features suggest people who were not content to drink only where water surfaced on its own, but who learned to dig, collect, and direct it, turning uncertain rainfall into more predictable supply. The logic is the same as in the delta's straight channels, but applied earlier and under more challenging conditions. Measure the land, understand the slope, and carve paths where water will reliably go. As the climate grew harsher, the skills embodied in these scattered basins and channels would become the difference between staying and leaving, and the lines of departure leave their marks too. Along the edges of shrinking lakes and along the routes between dwindling water sources, another kind of stonework appears. The quiet markers of movement itself. Migration pathways can be traced through cairn lines and rows of stones that function almost like proto-minus maps, guiding people along safe or familiar routes as the Sahara slowly transformed. These arrangements do more than mark a trail, they encode knowledge of distances, directions, and waypoints into the landscape, so that memory and stone work together to carry information forward. In this way, not only people but also ideas travel, techniques for cutting stone, methods of tracking stars, and strategies for water management move eastward toward the Nile, carried by those who can no longer remain in the drying interior. Where these paths converge, the fragments of different skills begin to overlay one another. In the high, open spaces of the western deserts, where wind polishes exposed rock and the sky seems to press close to the earth, the earliest stone alignments and building methods offer another kind of quiet clue. These structures show clear principles of measurement and construction, regular spacing, consistent orientations, and leveled surfaces that echo later techniques used in Egypt, though in a simpler, more experimental form. Here, the builders are not yet erecting massive monuments. They are learning how to test straightness against the horizon, how to keep a line true over distance, and how to repeat a chosen angle or direction across multiple stones. This is the practice ground of precision, where techniques are refined slowly through trial and error until they become reliable habits. To see where those habits might have been formalized and expanded, we now turn to the places where stone itself was extracted on a larger scale. Across Egypt, away from the finished monuments that attract most attention, abandoned quarries sit in quiet contrast to the polished faces of temples and pyramids. On the walls and floors of these quarries, tool marks and extraction patterns remain, some of which do not match the known methods of the dynastic period. Instead of the familiar signatures of copper tools used in textbook accounts, we find striations and chisel marks arranged in ways that suggest earlier, perhaps more experimental techniques. These differences hint at a sequence in which quarrying practices evolved over time, with older methods adapted or replaced as knowledge spread and tools changed. In these transitional marks, we may be seeing the physical residue of the same process of quiet refinement that began with simple stone alignments and grew into the capacity to detach and shape large blocks with confidence. The stone itself, however, is not the only medium where early minds left traces of their thinking. Inside smaller, more fragile objects from these pre-Minas dynastic horizons, another layer of evidence begins to appear in the form of markings on pottery and bone. These incised signs are not yet the full, flowing script of hieroglyphs, but they suggest a symbolic communication system that predates that later achievement. Repeated motifs, organized in patterns rather than casual scratches, indicate that people were using simplified symbols to record or convey something, perhaps ownership. Measures or ideas tied to place and ritual, When a mark is used again and again in the same context, it begins to function as a sign. And this quiet shift from drawing to symbol reflects a new way of handling information. The story of writing is oft untold as a sudden invention, but here the ground whispers of a slower, layered emergence from these early scratches to formalized signs. To see how these symbols might have intertwined with practical knowledge, we need to place them alongside water, stone, and sky. If we picture a modest pre-Minas dynastic settlement, perhaps something like Rim-D or Comelm, Hilg, and through this lens, its complexity becomes easier to feel. Within its planned layout, water channels run straight and purposeful, while workshops for fine craftsmanship and early metallurgy cluster where labor and resources are most efficiently used. Nearby, someone may carve a simple symbol into a pot that measures grain or marks a container used in a ritual linked to the turning of seasons guided by certain stars. Each of these details, water control, metalworking, symbolic marks, may seem small on its own, but together they trace a community that understands how to standardize practices and preserve instructions from one generation to the next. When we extend this pattern out across the Sahara, the Fayum, and the Nile Delta, it begins to look less like isolated ingenuity and more like a web of connected knowledge. That web becomes even more striking when we consider how climate pressure could have pulled its strands toward the Nile corridor. Along the receding shores of ancient lakes and across the narrowing belts of vegetation, the slow desiccation of the Sahara would have nudged groups eastward toward the more reliable waters of the Nile. Within, they likely carried memories of wells and basins dug in marginal lands, the habit of laying out cairn lines to mark routes, and the skill of reading both the night sky and the subtle shifts in terrain. When such groups reached the Nile Valley or the Delta, they would have encountered communities already experimenting with planning, water management, and craftsmanship, like those at Rim-D and Comelm, Hilg. The meeting of these traditions, one forged in the testing ground of desert survival, the other in the fertile balancing of flood and field, could quietly intensify the local knowledge base without leaving a dramatic signature in the historical record. Instead, the only record would be in the way annals become straighter, settlements more organized, and stonework more confident over time. This growing convergence sets the stage for a later leap in monumental building, even if the names of the people who prepared that leap are forgotten. If we step back and imagine a map stretching from the Black Zone to the Delta and Fayum, its surface slowly changing over millennia, a pattern begins to emerge. Early stone alignments tracking Orion and Sirius lie in one region scattered wells and basins. From 9000 BC, it dot another migration routes traced by proto-Minas maps of cairn lines run like faint veins toward the river, and at the northeastern edge, planned settlements with fine craftsmanship and early metallurgy anchor the emerging Nile communities. None of these elements alone explains the later precision of Giza, but together they form a dense matrix of skills: star watching, water engineering, route marking, material working, and symbolic recording. The emotional effect of seeing them aligned is not one of abrupt mystery but of patient build minus up, as if the land itself were rehearsing techniques over thousands of years before handing them to the pyramid builders. The comfort in this view comes from recognizing that what appears sudden in the historical record may have been slowly prepared in the spaces that record Minas keepers overlooked. To feel this preparation more clearly, it helps to return once more to the details of the Delta and deserts through the lens of these shared principles. Along the canals and fields of the Delta, the straight, deliberate channels cut into soft grounds seem to echo the strict lines of earlier desert wells and basins, even though they belong to a later moment in time. In both cases, people are imposing order on water, turning a fluid, shifting element into something predictable through the careful shaping of earth. The same mental tools, understanding slope, anticipating flow, standardizing widths or depth, are at work in the Sahara's early basins and the delta's more developed irrigation features, suggesting a continuity of thinking even if the communities themselves changed names and forms. When such thinking is applied to stone instead of soil, it can produce the straight trench of the black zone or the measured alignments that tracks Eros and Orion, where the medium is different, but the logic is similar. These repeated logics, appearing in waterworks, path marking, and sky trekking, hint at a shared cognitive framework that could later be focused on monumental tasks. To move from mine to stone on the grand scale, though, requires one more ingredient: a matured sense of measurement in 3 dimensions. Out in the open expanses where early builders experimented with stone alignments and small structures, we find the earliest hints of this 3-dimensional precision. Stones, set at regular intervals, circles with consistent diameters, and alignments that hold a steady course over uneven ground or reflect a capacity to project an abstract plane onto the irregularities of real terrain. This practice, once honed, makes it easier to imagine cutting a quarry face into regular blocks or aligning a long wall with a chosen celestial target, because the basic skills, heaping lines steady, angles repeatable, and distances consistent, are already in place. We usually think of such geometric competence as arising with formal surveying in later states, but these weathered stones suggest that the groundwork may have been laid by people whose names never entered any formal record. Their constructions are modest, yet the underlying principles resemble the more developed techniques seen in Egyptian building later on, where stone was removed rather than placed. Those principles left a different kind of mark for us to read. Within the silent hollows of abandoned quarries, the rock faces tell a layered story of extraction through their varied tools' signatures. Some surfaces bear the regular, familiar patterns of known dynastic methods, but others display sequences of marks that do not match those later techniques, as if early workers were testing different ways of separating stone from bedrock. These unmatching patterns suggest a period of experimentation before standard quarrying practices became fixed, a time when methods were evolving and knowledge was being refined from attempt to attempt. Combined with the evidence of early building principles in the desert and the practical planning of delta settlements, these quarry marks hint that stoneworking knowledge developed in stages, not as an abrupt invention. In this gradual refinement, we may be seeing the quiet bridge between the scattered skills of precursor cultures and the integrated mastery required at sites like Giza. To understand how such technical capacity could be stabilized and transmitted, we must remember the role of symbols in holding instructions across time. Bakker's small artifacts of pre-Minos dynastic life, the markings on pottery and bone, appear in a new light once we recognize their potential to encode practical information. A repeated symbol might not only indicate ownership or identity, it could also stand for a particular measure, a ritual moment tied to a star's position, or a standard quantity needed for a task. When these signs appear in association with containers, tools, or specific contexts, they suggest a community beginning to formalize the way knowledge is stored and shared, moving beyond memory and oral instruction alone. This step toward a symbolic communication system predating hieroglyphs would make it much easier to preserve and refine techniques over generations, especially in fields like metallurgy, water management, or stoneworking, where small layers could have large consequences. In this sense, the scratches on bone and clay may be the quiet companions of the straight channels and precise alignments we have been tracing. To see the full scope of what these companions imply, we can draw together the different types of early specialists hinted at in this landscape. Across the centuries, unshifting habitats we have walked through, a set of recurring figures emerges. The sky raiders aligning stones with Sirius and Orion, the water engineers cutting straight channels in the delting shaping basins in the Sahara and Ephraim, the root makers setting proto-minus maps in cairn lines, the stone workers refining extraction methods in now-minus abandoned quarries, and the symbol makers scratching early signs onto pottery and bone. Each of these roles addresses a different problem: navigating, irrigating, building, recording, but all rely on shared foundations of measurement, repetition, and pattern recognition. Rather than a single, monolithic lost civilization, the evidence suggests a mosaic of communities, each contributing quiet refinements to the toolkit that later builders would inherit. Seeing them as a connected field of precursor cultures, rather than isolated anomalies, helps dissolve the sense of abrupt change between green Sahara camps and the ordered stone of Giza. This way of seeing may not answer every question, but it turns scattered clues into parts of a coherent, if incomplete, picture. Over the long arc from 10,000 to 4,800 BCE and beyond, the land itself becomes the archive that preserves this picture in fragments. Stone alignments in the blacks and elsewhere track stars over millennia. Wells and basins from 9,000 BCE Istify to water engineering strategies spread across the Saharan and Fa migration pathways, inscribed in proto-minus maps of cairns, lead knowledge minus maps of cairns, lead knowledge minus bearing groups. The ring groups stored the island. Planned settlements like Mirindi and Kamel minus K, ILG, and show that by around 4,800 BCE, this accumulated knowledge was being expressed in more complex, organized communities. These are not random coincidences. They cluster around themes of control over water, familiarity with the sky, mastery of materials, and the beginnings of symbolic communication, all elements that later Egyptian civilization would integrate on a grand scale. The emotional resonance of this pattern lies in its reassurance that the skills behind the pyramids have deep roots in older, humbler practices, shaped by countless unnamed hands. To bring this resonance into focus at Giza itself, we now need to ask what kind of place the plateau might have been before the first pharaoh claimed it. If we now turn our valley and let these quiet threads of evidence trail behind us, the familiar monuments of later history take on a different atmosphere. Instead of rising abruptly from an empty background, they can be imagined as the latest expressions of a long, patient conversation between people, stone, sky, and water, a conversation that began in rock circles, desert wells, delta channels, and simple incised signs. The precursor cultures we have followed leave only scattered traces, but the consistency of their patterns hints at a sophisticated, interconnected pre-minus history that prepared the ground, both literally and figuratively, for what would come. In this view, the pyramid builders are not singular geniuses emerging from nowhere, but heirs to a vast, subtle inheritance of techniques and observations refined over thousands of years. As we move into the next part of our journey, we will bring these quiet inheritances to the foot of the Giza plateau and ask how they might have shaped its earliest, now minus forgotten uses. Standing once more on the wide stone of the Giza plateau, you can let the later pyramids fall quiet for a moment and listen instead to the bedrock beneath them. The familiar story places this landscape in the age of pharaohs, but the ground itself hints at uses that reach back beyond named kings and carved statues. A picture begins to form of the plateau as a place first chosen not for royal tombs, but for its position, its horizon, its stubborn level rock. In that picture, Giza starts as a bare stage of stone, already marked by observatories, quarries, or ceremonial structures long before the first pharaoh claimed it. Across the high, flat surfaces and gentle slopes of this plateau, the earliest visitors may have traced simple lines of sight between sky and stone. They would not have needed pyramids to do this, only marked points, low platforms, or shaped edges defining alignments with sunrise, sunset, and the slow wheel of specific stars. The story usually begins with the great monuments we can still see, but the plateau's suitability as an observatory would have existed thousands of years earlier. In this way, Giza may have started as a quiet instrument for watching the heavens rather than a cemetery for kings. That earlier phase sets the stage for what would later rise, here in cut stone, along the northern edge of this imagined ancient plateau. You might picture rougher scars of quarrying biting into the limestone long before the refined blocks of the Old Kingdom. The same solid bedrock that offers a stable base. The pyramids would have drawn stone workers seeking reliable material, close to the river yet high enough to stay dry. These first quarries may have supplied modest structures elsewhere, shrines, platforms, or boundary stones rather than towering monuments. The story usually credits Khufu and his architects with transforming Giza, but the notion of this place as a working quarry landscape likely belongs to generations we no longer remember. Out of such practical use, ceremonial and symbolic possibilities could quietly grow. Down along the softly rising spine of the plateau, the line of sight westward toward the setting sun offers another clue to its early attraction. For people attuned to both horizon and river, a high, dry shelf overlooking the floodplain would have been a natural place to mark transitions between day and night, season and season, life and death. These earliest users may have left only faint cuttings, leveled spots, or buried platforms that later builders reworked or erased. The story usually begins with finished temples, but before there were temples there were places where people simply gathered to watch the sky and mark its patterns. Those quiet gatherings carry the first echoes of the ceremonial landscape that Giza would eventually become. Out beyond the plateau, back, along the routes, we have followed through desert circles and delta settlements. The skills needed for later pyramid building were taking shape in slow, almost invisible ways. In small communities, unrecorded engineers experimented with leveling surfaces, aligning stones, and measuring consistent distances long before any of those abilities were applied to massive monuments. The abilities that seem sudden at Giza may, in fact, be the outcome of centuries of quiet refinement, passed from one generation to the next without fanfare. The story usually emphasizes a leap, but the evidence we have traced suggests a gradual slope of learning that slow pleads steadily toward the Nileland, eventually back to this plateau, along the damp margins of the early Nile delta, where channels work to manage water and protect fields. Builders learned to price straight lines and even gradients. A trench that carries water cleanly without pooling requires careful attention to level, just as a platform that stays dry above the flood requires precise surveying. These delta engineers had no pyramids to design, yet their work demanded the same disciplined eye for horizon and subtle slope. Over time, such habits of precision become second nature, shaping how people see and unspace. As that ray of Sing moves, it quietly prepares the minds that will later conceive of pyramids. Across the fading grasslands and shallow basins of the once minus-wetter Sahara, other groups were engaged in different, but related, experiments in ordering the landscape. When they placed stones in circles, lines, or mounds that matched recurring positions of the sun or stars, they were doing more than simple ritual. They were practicing consistent measurement of angles, directions, and intervals. The people we have followed through these stone alignments may not have imagined Giza, but they were refining a vocabulary of space that future builders could inherit. The story we tell of architecture often begins with cities, but here it begins with lonely stones on open ground. Those stones become part of the unseen ancestry of every later monument. On the high, dark zones of the desert where rock art wells and simple structures coexisted, the management of water added another layer of discipline. To dig a well where water can be reached, to line it, and to place it along paths that make sense for seasonal movement requires a deep understanding of the land's hidden structure. The people who achieved this did not leave us names, but they left patterns, repeated distances, favored orientations, and recurring relationships between water, shelter, and sky. This quiet, practical geometry would have traveled with them when conditions forced them to move. The direction of that movement brings us back toward the Nile. As the climate began to shift and the Sahara slowly dried between roughly 6,000 and 4,000 BC, these scattered groups faced a narrowing world. Lakes shrank, pastures withdrew, and the reliable wells that had sustained generations became more precarious. In such a landscape, the knowledge of where water still flowed and how to find it would have been the most valuable inheritance any community possessed. The story of collapse is often told as a sudden break, but here the evidence suggests drawn minus out adaptation and movement. That movement, carried across generations, points steadily eastward, down the gentle slopes that lead from desert plateau to river valley. Families and clans would have followed shrinking watercourses and remembered route, step by measured step. They brought with them more than tools and animals. They carried mental maps of star positions, ancient alignments, and tried minus and minus-tested ways of laying at space. To them, the Nile Valley would not have appeared as a blank slate, but as a new canvas upon which familiar principles could be carefully applied. The story usually separates desert cultures from river cultures, but climate and necessity likely braided them together. That braiding of traditions becomes essential when we look again at how the foundations of monumental architecture form. Along the early settlements that grew beside the Nile's branching channels, the skills of these migrants would have met those of long-minus established river folk. The careful leveling of fields, the tracking of floods, and the marking of safe building ground above high water already demanded quiet, local expertise. When the sky readers and water engineers from the drying deserts arrived, their ways of measuring and aligning would have found ready partners in the Nile community's own practices. Out of this meeting, more precise tradition of surveying and construction could slowly emerge. The story usually assigns such sophistication to later, unified states, but the groundwork may have been laid by this much earlier mingling. From that groundwork, the tools for pyramid building could begin to grow. Within these growing river communities, the refinement of simple tools would have accompanied the refinement of methods. A straight rod becomes more carefully shaped, a measuring cord more consistently knotted, a plumb line more exact in its length and weight. None of this would have looked dramatic at the time. It would have unfolded as modest improvements in everyday tasks. Laying walls, setting posts, digging basins, orienting doorways. Yet each small increase in consistency makes more ambitious projects thinkable. In this slow, cumulative process, you can glimpse how a culture might one day contemplate raising precisely aligned, massive structures on a scale their ancestors never imagined. The next step in that contemplation brings us back to the plateau of Giza. Standing at the imagined edge of a pre-Inus pharaonic Giza, we can now see it as a quiet convergence point rather than an isolated wonder. Here, the solid limestone bedrock meets open sky and overlooks the intricate life of the river plain, making it an ideal place for people trained in both water and sky to practice their crafts. Early surveyors could have used the high ground to fix reference lines, test leveled surfaces, and mark key directions relative to rising or setting stars. These activities may have left only scratches, cut edges, and leveled zones later obscured by grander works. Yet, in those forgotten preparations lies the seed of the plateau's later transformation. Along the faint traces of ancient quarry faces, we might also imagine experimental extractions. Blocks cut and moved short distances, techniques tested and revised, work gangs learning how stone behaves under sustained effort. The people doing this work would not yet have been pyramid builders, but they would have been learning the same lessons of leverage, fracture lines, and transport routes that their descendants would apply on an enormous scale. The story usually celebrates the finished form of the Great Pyramid, but the knowledge that made it possible had to be proven on smaller stones and shorter journeys first. Those quiet trials, repeated countless times, begin to shape the plateau's character as a training ground. Across the plateau's open expanses, early ceremonial uses may have overlapped with this practical labor. A leveled area used by day to test alignments or resemble stone could, by night, become a place where people gathered to marks celestial events with rites and stories. To those who stood there, the distinction between engineering and ritual may not have been sharp. Both activities sought to bring human life into meaningful relationship with the stable patterns of sky and land. The story usually divides sacred space from workspace, but in such an early context, they are likely intertwined. In that entwining, the foundations of a future sacred minus industrial landscape emerge. Down near where later causeways and temples would stand, we might picture earlier paths worn into the rock by repeated use, following natural contours and sightlines. These routes, chosen for ease or symbolic direction, could have established a template that later builders formalized in stone, turning beaten tracks into paved processional ways. What seems in later times like a sudden flourish of design may thus rest upon generations of informal practice, shaped by geography and habit. The story usually gives credit to named architects, but anonymous feet likely trace the first lines those architects would refine. These lines link the plateau's earliest users to its most celebrated monuments. Along the growing Nile settlements, the methods for leveling, aligning, and measuring were becoming not only technical skills but cultural norms. Children would watch older relatives stretch cords, sight to long plumb lines, and talk in terms of precise angles and straightness as everyday concerns, not arcane crafts. In such an environment, the idea of building large, orderly structures would appear less alien. It would be an extension of values already woven into daily life. The story usually depicts monumental architecture as an extraordinary undertaking, but within this context, it becomes a natural outgrowth of persistent, shared habits of precision. Those habits, carried to Giza, set the mental stage for the plateau's grand transformation. On the high rock where the Great Pyramid would eventually stand, we can imagine a final phase of quiet preparation before royal authority formalized everything in stone. Surveyors might have established a master grid, refining it through repeated checks against the stars and horizon, while workmen smoothed and leveled broader surfaces than ever before. The techniques they used, measuring baselines, checking right angles, ensuring flatness, draw on all the earlier experiments in delta fields, desert circles, and quarries. The story usually isolates these feats as unique to a particular reign, but we can now see them as the point where many converging streams of knowledge meet. At that point of convergence, the forgotten and the recorded briefly share the same ground. Across the plateau in this moment, the methods of the early builders and the emerging Egyptian traditions merge into something new. The practical geometries of unrecorded engineers blend with a developing symbolic order that links kingship, cosmos, and landscape in a single grand design. The leveling that once served fields and small platforms now serves vast stone bases. The alignments that once tracked seasons now define the axes of royal tombs. The story usually separates technical and spiritual motives, but here they appear as faces of the same impulse to bring human order into harmony with the wider world. That fusion becomes the foundation for all subsequent monumental architecture in the region. Down inside the core masonry of the great structures, hidden beneath their smooth outer lines, the legacy of these earlier techniques lives on in less visible ways. The careful fitting of interior blocks, the consistent courses, and the maintained orientation from base to summit all depend on underlying methods that had been honed far from royal eyes. The later monuments make those methods spectacular, but they do not invent them. The story usually highlights the visible surfaces, yet the deeper story is written in the unseen joints and subtle consistencies only close study reveals. In those quiet details, the hands of forgotten teachers can still be felt, along the broken edges of quarries surrounding Giza scattered elsewhere across the land. We see another kind of continuity between unknown builders and known pharaonic works. Extraction scars along the brooks, abandoned blocks, and half-minus finished cut show attempts, adjustments, and refinements still in progress when work stopped. Whether due to exhaustion, changing plans, or shifting power, some of these marks resemble later, well-minus understood techniques. Others stand slightly apart, hinting at methods that may have been tested and then superseded. The story usually reads quarries only as sources for finished monuments, but they are also archives of trial and error. Those trials link the experimental past to the confident execution we admire today. Across the whole Egyptian landscape, when you look at it as a layered palimpsest rather than a series of isolated sites, the picture becomes clearer. Places like Giza, which seem to burst fully formed into history, instead emerge as nodes, where long-minus running experiments in stone, sky, and water came together and crystallized. This sense of gradual crystallization fits well with the scattered traces we have followed from stone circles and desert wells to delta channels and pre-minus dynastic symbols. The story usually compresses such developments into a few named centuries, but the land suggests a deeper time scale. On that extended scale, Giza becomes the final echo of a world already old. Down in the silence beneath the current terraced paths, layers of this older world may still lie hid in earlier cuttings, filled pits, repurposed foundations, or reworked platforms incorporated into later construction. Each time the plateau was reshaped, something of the previous phase was probably erased, yet certain alignments or base surfaces may have persisted out of convenience, respect, or simple inertia. The people who reused them may not have known how old they were, only that they still functioned well. The story usually assumes that later builders always started fresh, but practical builders often reuse what still stands. That tendency offers one more way, in which the unknown and the known builders overlap. Across time, as writing emerges and drawers carve their names deep into stone, the earlier contributors to the shared achievement recede into anonymity. Their techniques survive, but their stories do not. Their alignments endure, but the myths that surrounded them are lost. What we meet in the historical record is already a mature tradition standing on invisible foundations. The story usually honors the named and forgets the rest, yet the physical evidence whispers that countless unrecorded minds shaped the methods those names later used. In honoring the monuments, we are also, unknowingly, honoring those erased foundations. Standing now at the edge of our own knowledge, we can gather the main possibilities for how this deep pre-minus history relates to the pyramids. One views suggests a desiccated pre-minus dynastic culture that directly influenced later builders, acting almost like a hidden ancestor whose fingerprints can be seen in specific techniques and alignments. Another sees many independent communities, delta engineers, desert skyreaders, water managers, each contributing a piece that later converged in the Nile Valley without a single guiding center. A third emphasizes the role of climate, suggesting that gradual environmental stress stripped away settlements and memory, leaving only stonework as evidence of a transitional civilization. The story usually demands one definitive explanation, but the scattered nature of the clues may mean that elements of all three are quietly true. Along every line we have followed, there remains the unresolved question of identity. Who exactly were these forgotten builders whose traces underpin Giza? We can describe their skills, infer their concerns, and trace their movement, but we cannot reliably attach names, languages, or specific ethnic labels to them without stepping beyond the evidence. Their anonymity produces a particular kind of other recognition that immense contributions to human knowledge can vanish from cultural memory while the results remain solid underfoot. The story usually seeks heroes and founders, but here we encounter only a collective, faceless persistence. That faceless draws our attention back to the stones themselves as the primary witnesses. Across the weathered faces of those stones, whether in remote desert circles or at the base of the pyramids, we encounter the final, stubborn marks of these unknown hands. Chisel lines, flat planes, carefully chosen orientations, and the very decision to build in stone rather than in permanent materials all testify to a deliberate desire to endure. Yet even stone cannot preserve stories intact. It keeps only shape, position, and faint scars of the making process. The story usually treats these as background details, but in our exploration they become the main text. By reading them patiently, we let the land itself tell as much of the erased story as it still can. Down through the layers of time, from the Green Sahara to the consolidated Egyptian state, the themes we have traced: attention to sky, mastery of water, refinement of stonework from a continuous thread. This thread does not require sudden miracles or lost technologies. It only requires that we respect the quiet accumulation of skill and observation over thousands of years. When those accumulated abilities finally meet favorable social and political conditions, the result can be something as imposing as the Giza pyramids. The story usually isolates such monuments as singular achievements, but we can now see them as the visible crest of a much longer wave. That wave began far from the Nile, in places few visitors will ever see. Standing back from the pyramids now, you can hold two images in your mind at once. In one, the familiar outlines rise from the plateau as royal tombs, aligned to the cardinal directions and watched over by the Sphinx. In the other, that same plateau appears as it might have looked long before, cut by modest quarries, dotted with low platforms, and visited by sky watchers and surveyors whose concerns were as much practical as ceremonial. These two images do not conflict, rather. They nest within each other like successive sketches leading to a finished drawing. The story usually stops at the final sketch, but our journey has tried to restore some of the earlier lines. Across this restored landscape, the pyramids no longer appear as abrupt marvels, but as the latest expression of a long, thoughtful engagement with the environment. The same patience that once aligned simple stone circles now governs the precise orientation of massive bases. The same care that once guided water channels now informs the leveling of entire acres of bedrock. Even if we never know the names of the first people to stand on the Giza plateau and test its potential, we can understand the logic that would have drawn them there. The story usually emphasizes what is visible and named, but the invisible and unnamed have shaped it just as deeply. In recognizing that, we arrive at a different kind of respect for both the monuments and their forgotten foundations. Along the quiet edges of this realization runs a gentle sadness, the awareness that whole worlds of stories sung and daily life have vanished, leaving only technical traces behind. The unknown builders, engineers, and sky readers are present to us only as patterns of precision, as if their lives have been distilled down to geometry in stone. Yet in that geometry we can sense their patience, their repeated trials, their long conversations with land and sky. The story usually celebrates victory over time, but here we also feel time's power to erase. That very erasure invites us to look more carefully at what remains. Down in the depths of your own attention, if you let it settle on these scattered clues, a different kind of connection forms, not to pharaohs and dynasties, but to the countless unnamed people whose labor and thought slowly made such dynasties possible. Their legacy is not measured in written chronicles, but in the enduring stability of platforms, the persistence of alignments, the quiet accuracy of corners that still face the cardinal directions. These are humble technical achievements, yet they outlast kings. The story usually ties our sense of awe to grand narratives, but here the all eyes impatient, anonymous work. To notice it is to widen our understanding of what shapes history. Across the long arc we have traveled, from desert wells to delta channels to the Giza plateau, one principle keeps returning: the land remembers what writing forgets. Terraces, quarries, alignments, and foundations record choices that people made in response to sky and water, and those choices accumulate into regional traditions that can endure even when cultures change. When we read these traces alongside the later monuments, the relationship between the pyramids and a much older world becomes not only plausible but almost inevitable. The story usually frames Giza as an exception, but under this light, it appears as the culmination of a long, quiet conversation with the environment. That conversation is still there to be overheard, if we know how to listen. Standing at the close of this quiet journey, you and I can accept that many details will remain unresolved while still feeling that a meaningful picture has emerged. We may never know the exact faces or voices of the forgotten builders, yet their presence can be felt in the enduring precision of the stones and the subtle continuity between early experiments and later masterworks. In this sense, the Giza Plateau is not just a monument to the pharaohs, but also a monument to all the unnamed generations whose skills and insights underlie it. The story usually ends with kings in their tombs, but our ending rests instead on the foundations they themselves inherited. In honoring those foundations, we honor a deeper, quieter layer of human history. Across your own imagination now stretches a landscape in which the visible pyramids sit firmly upon an older, mostly hidden world of forgotten observatories, quarries, and ceremonial places. The skills that raised these pyramids did not appear from nowhere. They evolved through centuries of refinement among unrecorded delta engineers and desert cultures, carried eastward as the Sahara dried and absorbed into emerging Egyptian traditions. These early builders left only stone, stripped of names and stories, but their marks can still be read if we approach them with patience and humility. The story usually leaves such people in shadow, but you have walked a little way into that shadow and let your eyes adjust. Thank you for staying with us through this quiet journey into the world that existed before Egypt. Until then, rest well, stay curious, and let the mysteries of the ancient world guide you gently into the next discovery.